Congressman Hice, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really
Thanks
appreciate
for having me.
You almost certainly would have been elected to a 5th term if you had chosen to run again in the 10th District. Why did you decide to run against Brad Raffensperger, a Republican from your own party, for Secretary of State?
Well, it's a great question. I get that asked a lot. And the bottom line, look, I've been, among other things, I'm on the Oversight Committee in Washington. And for 2.5 years in the Oversight Committee, we've been dealing with a federal attempt to take over elections. And I've been on the tip of the spear on that battle. And so this whole election thing started becoming a major issue for me about 2.5 years ago, to the extent that myself and I think every member of the Georgia delegation actually had a conference call with Brad to say, look, here's what's happening in D.C. We were hearing rumors that Stacey Abrams and company wanted to do some similar things of sending out ballots and all this sort of thing to everyone on the voter registration files. And so we just said, Brad, watch out, don't do this kind of. And so that transitioned me from not only keeping a pulse federally, but also what was happening here in Georgia. And of course, after the election, it was just a disaster. And I just felt like somebody needs to challenge Brad.
Okay. Well, you've had a year and a half to sort of digest everything that happened. Do you believe now, in retrospect, that President Biden won fair and square in Georgia?
I believe the election here in Georgia reeked with fraudulent activity. When you look at, just for example, sending out nearly 7 million unsolicited absentee ballot requests, having virtually no voter identification with those ballot requests, drop-off boxes, which we are now all watching, hundreds of hours of video footage of ballot harvesting taking place. You look at all of this combined and you realize this election literally reeked with fraudulent activity. And so, yeah, I believe there were a lot of problems in this last election, no question.
Let me press you on that. The former president's own Attorney General, Bill Barr, said that any allegations of widespread fraud were BS. He actually used the full word. We had the U.S. Attorney's Office here get involved. The FBI looked into what happened at State Farm. The GBI was involved as well. All of those folks said, yes, there was instances of fraud. 4 dead people voted. Their families took in their ballots, that sort of thing. But that there was no credible allegation of widespread fraud. What evidence do you have to the contrary?
Listen, all right, Georgia's voter registration files, 10% inaccurate. That is nothing that anyone denies, anywhere from 8 to 15%. But the national average is 10%. I would say Georgia's 10% inaccurate files. When you send out 7 million absentee ballot requests unsolicited,
well, knowing that obviously that was because of the pandemic. Extraordinary
but the point is going back to how do we know there were problems in this election? You sent out 7 million absentee ballot requests unsolicited and 10% inaccurate files. That means you are giving an invitation to some 700,000 people who don't even belong on our files. That was the first step that was massively erroneous for Brad Raffensperger to make. And then opening up drop-off boxes. Bill Barr, I'm sure probably at that point didn't have the videos we have now. Thousands of hours of video footage of over 240 people, 5,600 different drop-offs, thousands of ballots involved. Ballot harvesting, it's illegal. It happened here. We watched it happen. So, look, the evidence that has come forth since the early days is enough to draw all sorts of suspicion on this election.
Okay, let's talk about the January 2nd phone call between former President Trump and Brad Raffensperger. During that call, the former president made a raft of false claims that 5,000 dead people had voted, that 60,000 underage teenagers had voted. The actual number there was 0, or that several thousand unregistered voters had voted. The actual number on that score was 0. Several dozen felons tried to vote and they were found out. What do you make of the president basically making false allegations and, in Raffensperger's estimation, threatening him during that call?
I think at the end of the day what the president was saying was, Brad Raffensperger, do your job. There were all sorts of numbers floating around at that time, lots of numbers. What the president did not bring up was the fact of nearly 7 million unsolicited absentee ballot requests. He did not bring up the fact of the drop-off boxes, the ballot harvesting that was taking place. He did not bring up $50 million of Zuckerberg money that Brad Raffensperger used to tip the scales. There's lots of things the president did not bring up. He brought up numbers, that a lot of numbers were floating around at the time, but the bottom line of the discussion, Brad Raffensperger, do your job. Make sure this is a fair election. And that's a fair question at that point.
All right, at that point, the 7.5 million ballots had already been sent out. What would you have done differently in December of 2020 than Brad Raffensperger did?
I would have never sent out those absentee ballot requests.
But again, that was a done deal at that point.
Well, it didn't have to be. He still did it unilaterally, his own decision, and it was a disastrous decision. It destroyed election integrity in this state. I would have never done that.
Well, now let's talk about Cobb County. There were 15,000 ballots, absentee ballots, randomly audited in Cobb County, and I'm sure you know they turned up no fraud at all. So
let's talk about Fulton County. Just the opposite. Why would he go to Cobb County where there were not the allegations of the widespread fraud? Why does not Brad Raffensperger go to the places where the accusations of fraud take place? Instead, he goes to some place where there were no serious allegations. That in itself is nothing but a smokescreen covering up him not doing his job that he should have been doing.
Okay, let me ask you, and I'm going to grab my glasses here because I'm getting old. Actually, that happened before. About what the president said to Brad Raffensperger during the call, and Ryan Germany, his lawyer, said it's more illegal for you than it is for them, talking about shredding ballots because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense and you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer, a big risk. Brad Raffensperger says he felt like he was threatened by the president. Does that sound like a threat to you?
It didn't sound like a threat to me. He was speaking truth. I don't see that as a threat at all. Again, I look at that conversation and I hear the president saying, Brad, there's allegations floating around like crazy in Georgia. Do your job and make sure we have a free and fair election.
Okay. You met with the president in December of 2020, December 21st, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us anything about that meeting, what your advice was to the president as he approached January 6th?
Well, I mean, it was really a meeting that just said there were a number of people from different states, and it was like, what happened? There were problems all over the country. My focus was on challenging the electoral votes from Georgia, and you know, again, that is because the abysmal job that Brad Raffensperger has done that threw our entire election here in Georgia in question, and so I was offering a challenge to that.
What do you make of the Republican Party in Georgia coming up with an alternate slate of Trump electors? I mean, that sounds fundamentally undemocratic, is it not?
Well, I mean, the Republican Party has also censured Brad Raffensperger. You know, I mean, this is a Republican Party, by and large, that is keenly aware that this election was filled with problems. And Brad should have never certified this without doing due diligence and getting into the depth of an investigation to determine what really happened in this election and what represents an authentic representation of the people's voice.
Okay. He says he thinks of this job as Secretary of State as being more procedural than political. Why should voters, Republican voters and then Democratic voters potentially, or independents in the general election, why should voters in Georgia believe that you would approach this in a procedural way, not bring partisan bias to the job of Secretary of State?
Yeah, look, the job of the Secretary of State is to oversee and make sure that we have free and fair elections. The issue is not who wins an election. The issue is, was it a fair election? If my candidate loses, yeah, I may be upset about that, but if it was a fair election, we can always come back next time and rally the troops and try to win the next election. But if ever, Russ, if ever the consent of the governed, the voice of the people is compromised or violated at the ballot box, then we as a nation are in serious trouble. And I believe that compromise took place under the leadership of Brad Raffensperger. And as Secretary of State, my commitment is to make sure that this type of activity, just randomly sending out ballot requests, randomly having these drop-off boxes, accepting third-party money, to tip the scale. These things should never happen in an election. It's one legal ballot cast, one legal ballot counted. That's not rocket science, but that's my commitment. Who wins, wins, but we've got to have free and fair elections.
So the 3 recounts, they don't give you any confidence that ultimately this was a fair election?
We've got to have audits and investigations. Look, if you've got $100 of counterfeit money, it really doesn't matter how many times you recount the money. You may get the recount, but it's still counterfeit money. The question is, how many of these ballots were legally cast ballots? And we'll never know the answer to that question because we sent them out to, as I mentioned before, some 700,000 people who don't even belong on our files. How many of them voted? We'll probably never know the answer to that. How do we know? They've now been separated from the envelope. So these are the types of things, the types of mistakes that Brad Raffensperger made that has forever damaged, at least until we have a correction of it all, the election integrity process in this state.
Does President Trump have any responsibility for the lack of confidence in the outcome of the election, given the fact that he was saying months before the vote that the only way that he could lose is if it were rigged?
He doesn't have any responsibility in terms of the decisions that Brad Raffensperger made to indeed destroy election integrity in this state. These were 100% decisions that rest on the shoulders of Brad Raffensperger, and to try to deflect those responsibilities to anyone other than Brad, I think is a grave mistake.
On January 6th, after the riot, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, you were among 139 Republicans, if I'm not mistaken, who voted not to certify the election results. Do you have any regrets about that? Why did you do that?
No, look, in the first place, I condemn all acts of violence. There were what happened on January 6th should not have happened. I'm clear on the record of where I stand on that. And by the way, the other 574 declared riots that took place before that one in different parts of the country. So just to make that clear, I stand against violent activity and all that sort of stuff. But no, I have no regrets for challenging the electoral votes from Georgia because it was such in question. The election here was massively placed in question by the decisions of Brad Raffensperger, and as a representative from this state and a U.S. congressman, I feel it's my duty to stand up when I feel an election was in question.
Okay. 11 days later, Marjorie Taylor Greene texted Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, that members are saying, some members, and she didn't name them, are saying that the only way to save the republic is to impose martial law. Were you one of those who was in favor of martial law at that point?
I'm not familiar with that text, but no.
But what's your opinion? What was your opinion then about martial law?
All I want's a fair election. I'm not in favor now of martial law or any of this type of thing, but I am in favor of getting to the bottom of it. We can't fix going forward if we don't investigate and find out what went wrong in this past election. And to this day, that still hasn't happened.
Well, do you think SB 202 fixed things?
It's a great step in the right direction, absolutely. And I think it's for that reason that, and by the way, we have SB 202 solely because of the horrible job that Brad Raffensperger did to our state, and the General Assembly had to step up and close some of the gaping holes that he created. But as a result of SB 202 being passed in Georgia, Heritage Foundation has now determined that this is the strongest election law in the country. I think it's a good step in the right direction. Probably some more things that need to be added along the way, but it's a good step in the right direction, and I'm deeply appreciative of the General Assembly.
I found this on my door just the other day. Vote absentee. Governor Kemp asking people to vote absentee. Is this saying that the Republican Party is endorsing the security of absentee balloting now in Georgia?
I don't know if it's a formal position by the Republican Party, but look, there's no question that absentee ballots are now here to stay. So
well, they were voted on initially by Republicans, approved by Republicans in 2006.
Yeah, there's no question about that. But what happened under Brad Raffensperger's leadership, look, we had 1.4 million absentee ballots cast under Brad Raffensperger's leadership. Never, ever, ever have we had anywhere close to those numbers. And as a result, it totally overwhelmed.
Because of COVID, though, right?
No, because of his decision to unsolicited send out almost 7 million requests.
Because of COVID.
But anyone could have, with COVID, they could have still requested an absentee ballot and received one. But to send them out without even being solicited, with the kind of erroneous numbers that we have on our files, is a very dangerous move if what you're wanting is secure elections. And therein lies the beginning of the problem that Brad created in this state that exists right now that needs to be corrected.
If you win and are in charge, what do you do with the Dominion voting machines?
Look, Dominion is another big problem. It requires, Georgia's under contract with Dominion. It is not something that the Secretary of State can solely just say we're no longer going to use Dominion machines. It will require exiting a contract, which takes action from the General Assembly, as well as the Secretary of State, a partnership therein. But I do believe that the people of Georgia have lost confidence in the Dominion voting machines. And if for no other reason, that is reason enough that I believe we should get out of the contract with Dominion and move on to a system that is more secure and one that creates more confidence for the voters of this state.
What would that system look like?
I don't know. Obviously, there'd be a lot of different options that would come to the table, but I certainly am not opposed to having paper ballots where people choose their candidates and so forth, and it's right there in front of us without any question of potential problems through QR codes or whatever else may be in machines.
Okay. I appreciate all your time. Before we end, because people are going to have a chance to watch all of this on the unedited version on our YouTube channel and our website, tell people a little bit about Jody Hice that they might not know.
Well, I've been in Congress now for 4 terms. I'm wrapping up my 8th here. Prior to that, I was about 30 years a pastor. And we had a couple of big battles that came our way that kind of transitioned me out of the pulpit ministry into more public service. And look, we are a country that works upon the concept of not only the consent of the governed at the ballot box, but we're a country that works off we the people and involvement of the people. And I believe that people need to engage what's happening in be it their city, their county, their school boards, whatever, to show up and to be involved. And that was partly what transitioned me out of the pulpit ministry into public service to this extent. And I encourage people to follow us at jodyhice.com. They can find out more information. And I would close just by saying I'm deeply honored to have the endorsement of President Trump. He came out early and supported me, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, let me ask you one last question on that score. You've been in Washington 8 years, had a chance to observe President Trump for 4 years as president. Is there any issue on which you disagree with the former president?
Look, I wouldn't always tweet the kinds of things that he would tweet, but I can tell you this about President Trump. He loves this country, and he's committed. When he talks about putting America first, he puts America first. He's an incredible man of action, and when he wants to get things done, he puts together a team to get things done. He's a very delightful individual. He's fun. He's funny. He's enjoyable to be around, and I wish those aspects of him were readily seen. Unfortunately, we have a national media that refuses to show that side of President Trump, but I had a great honor working with him, serving with him, and being on the trenches on a lot of issues.
All right. Jody Hice, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate you coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.